As late as summer of 1945, the US was still prepared for an all-out invasion of Japan. The operation codename was Downfall. Ultimately, that invasion did not happen, as Japan surrendered after the 2 atomic bomb attacks. But if it had gone on, it would have easily been the largest amphibious assault operation in history, dwarfing D-Day in its scope for each of its 2 big landings on 2 different front lines. But what if a similarly ambitious operation was planned today? Could today's US military force successfully invade Japan, defended by the modern-day Japanese military? Watch the video to find out. US invading Japan is a huge what-if moment, of course, but such wild ideas can be experimented with in Conflict of Nations, a free-to-play strategy game sponsoring this video. In it, the player takes control of one of many real modern-day nations, modeled complete with their militaries. Real-time combat then pits the player against more than 100 other players in a game of world conquest. You can play with the same account on both PC and mobile. And if you click the link in the description, you'll get a special bonus: 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. You can also just scan the QR code if that's easier for you. Try it out, choose your country and dominate the world. Let's get back to our video. There are several big differences when one compares the situation of 1945 to the situation today. One would be technology, as the way war is waged changed in the last 75 years. The other would be the fact that the US and Japan today aren't set up to fight each other. Nor is there a massive war on the horizon, with both sides mobilizing their population. So the starting forces would be quite a bit smaller than those planned in 1945. But perhaps the single biggest difference is that the US military already has quite a bit of troops on Japanese soil. That's been true ever since World War II ended, as the US occupied Japan. In the 1950s, the US maintained some 100 to 200,000 troops in Japan. That figure dropped to well under 100,000 by the 1970s. It has remained at 50-something thousand ever since. US forces were there to augment the Japanese forces if it ever came to a fight against the Soviet Union, and today against Russia and China. So this hypothetical war would start in a weird place, with dozens of US military facilities scattered around Japan. The US Army has some storage and logistics facilities, but has the smallest footprint in Japan. The Air Force has 3 big bases, 2 of which on Japan's main islands. The Navy's 3 big bases are all on the main islands. The Marine Corps is more spread out, with most of their bases on the island of Okinawa, to the south of Japan. Actually, Okinawa features more US forces than Japanese ones, and some 29,000 troops, more than half of all US troops, are stationed there, including a whole Marine infantry division. The rules of Binkov's hypothetical war scenarios always stipulate sudden start of hostilities, as well as no third-party interference, save for commercial trade. There is no nuke usage and starting morale is the same. The war would have an extremely swift and bloody start. You see, many US facilities in Japan are actually shared with the Japanese military. There would be instances where fighting would start within minutes. The initial days of the war would thus see frantic movements in, out and around Japan. The Japanese Air Force's SAM units and naval ships would try to shoot down the US planes trying to flee, or block them before enough army units can be mobilized so they actually enter the US bases. Most of those US bases on the main islands would fall quickly. It's just inevitable, with 25,000 US personnel scattered around in many bases, surrounded by a much more numerous enemy. Also, with the exception of a small Marines camp on Kyushu and some special forces, those other US forces are mostly Air Force and Navy personnel. The US simply doesn't station that many actual infantrymen on mainland Japan. Dozens of US planes would be destroyed, either by the Japanese or the US personnel themselves, so those don't get captured. Almost all of the US Navy's 7th Fleet would most likely find itself trapped, since it's permanently homeported to bases near Tokyo and on Kyushu, except for those ships that happen to be out to sea when the war suddenly starts. Of course, similar issues would beset the Japanese forces on Okinawa. The Japanese military there features only 1 army brigade and 1 airbase with a few dozen planes. Those would quickly be dealt with by the more numerous US forces. The island itself is fairly tiny and distances would be covered in mere hours. The days after might still see some urgent attacks. The US would be trying to protect its Okinawa forces, sending in additional ground troops and aircraft, airlifting in air defenses until the US Navy ships can come and form an air defense umbrella. In theory, Japan might have a very small window of opportunity to try and send a force to liberate Okinawa before the US forces there swell too much. But there are issues. The US would have around 100 combat planes on Okinawa, with more coming. Total Japanese air forces would number under 300 fighter jets, once some of the F-15s lost at the Okinawa base are accounted for. The Japanese Air Force is fairly low on guided air-to-ground munitions. Japan's own policy basically forbade such weapons until recently. Operating from 500 miles away, the Japanese Air Force would not really control the skies over Okinawa. The technological edge would favor the US forces, as part of the Japanese planes are stuck with Cold War-era technology, and actual assaults with troops would have to be mounted. If Japan did try to take Okinawa, it would most likely fail. Its ready forces meant for such ops are simply not numerous enough. They would meet the remainder of the US Marine Division after the initial battles of Okinawa and still be outnumbered. The Japanese amphibious assault fleet isn't even large enough for the entire amphibious assault troop contingent at once, so trying to take a piece of land on Okinawa only to risk losing those forces too once the US Navy and Air Force cut the supply lines would not be sensible. Instead, all those quick reaction forces as well as transport planes and ships would most likely be used to reinforce the islands to the north of Okinawa as quickly as possible. The thing is, for the US to invade Japanese mainland islands, there is really just one very evident route of attack. Such massive invasions need so much logistics that crossing large distances over the sea is a non-starter. What's needed are port facilities fairly close by, which means a piece of land, an island. And the Japanese Ryukyu Islands are the obvious candidate for that. Okinawa is just one of those islands, but there are more, even closer to Kyushu, up north. Most have some decent infrastructure and could readily receive troops from either side. The US would need quite a bit of time to actually get a hold of Okinawa properly. The island's population numbers 1.3 million, and there's bound to be a lot of insurrection. Those initial days when the US forces aren't yet plentiful might even see paramilitaries temporarily overrunning some bases. Eventually, the naval blockade and the lack of food would pacify the civilian population. The blockade threat would play into the fate of the northern islands as well. On one hand, Japan could send many troops to those islands, but it would need to supply those islands as well. So what happens if the US forces simply cut off the island supplies without actually invading them? Plus, there's a finite number of Japanese troops available, and Japan has a lot of area to protect. So it's not likely Japan would actually try to turn every single one of those islands into bastions populated by 10,000 troops or more. There'd be a long period of not much activity on land. The US would gather its forces, send in its aircraft carriers, build up more bases around Okinawa, take the Japanese islands to the southwest and use those for bases as well. Populate Wake Island and islands around Guam with more planes and ships. All those preparations, which would include sending ships and many ground troops, would take easily 6 months, but likely even a whole year. The Ogasawara Islands to the east would also likely get taken, but their geography and lack of infrastructure mean they wouldn't be big logistics hubs for the US invasion. Of course, during all that time, the US would try to do 3 things. Cut off the influx of trade to Japan, so its economy is weakened. That may not be so easy. Splitting up the US Navy assets so all the approaches to Japan are covered, including the Sea of Japan, would likely mean 2 heavy casualties for the US Navy. If there is one area where the Japanese military is strong, it's anti-shipping and anti-submarine warfare. Since Japanese assets would be right there and the US vessels would often need to sail to deployment areas from afar, the US ships in the Sea of Japan might be simply overwhelmed by Japanese attacks. Japanese ships, aircraft and subs would swell in numbers in that area. Coastal missile batteries would use either radars placed on mountains or radars on various helicopters and aircraft feeding them targeting data. The Japanese anti-submarine aircraft are plentiful and planes can also carry anti-ship missiles. Having to fly over Japan's air defenses to even get to the Sea of Japan would mean not a lot of US planes could operate there. Of course, pretty much all combat planes and AWACS planes could also detect naval targets, and give out targeting info to missile launch platforms. Some of the jets would also be able to carry anti-ship missiles by themselves. Smaller or more mobile ships firing from positions near the Japanese coastline well inside the SAM umbrella would also likely help, while the larger ships with both air defenses and anti-submarine capabilities might be tasked with protecting the narrow straits between Russian Sakhalin Island and between South Korea. The Sea of Japan was one of the main areas for Japan's navy to cover in the Cold War, but now it would serve as a lifeline for Japan's economy, especially those two straits where Japanese cargo ships could quickly reach the protection of South Korean or Russian territorial waters. Remember, the rule set of the scenario forbids widening the conflict to third-party countries. Japanese submarines are among the best in the world when it comes to non-nuclear subs. The very small distances to be covered as they defend the choke points would make them extremely dangerous, almost as dangerous as the US nuclear-powered subs. Of course, all those Japanese assets would not last forever. Using those initial 6 to 12 months of prep, the US would be constantly searching for all those ships and subs. Sometimes it would catch them out to sea, or in a port, or during maintenance. Slowly but surely, US missile attacks and air attacks would make the Japanese navy smaller and smaller. That wouldn't come cheap for the US. While a lot of Japanese air forces would be pinned down, the sheer number of commercial airports in Japan would mean there would always be some Japanese planes operating, next to a very potent air defense network, originally devised to deter the Soviets, but now used against the US. Given that the US would still have its air bases quite far away and that it would struggle to house even more than several hundred combat planes at once in those bases, the critical mass of US planes both for self-protection and attacks would be lacking. The US might be losing a dozen jet planes per day in the initial attacks. Only after some months have passed and the Air Force and SAM network have been partially neutralized would those losses go down. Aircraft carriers would help to an extent, especially since they might be able to launch planes fairly close to Japan, but they don't carry a lot of planes and can't be on station forever. Likely not more than 3 carriers could be maintained near Japan long term. Once the US does manage to safely overfly Japan on a daily basis, with Japanese air defenses and air forces almost fully neutralized, the actual invasion might be able to start, which doesn't mean it would. By then both sides would mobilize fully, possibly adding even more forces than the current active and reserve force. Using the time to train more forces as paratroopers or amphibious assaults would be a given for the US. The US Army Reserve does not feature combat units. But only a very small fraction of those US forces could actually land on Japan in a short time frame, at least if we are talking about an invasion a year from the start of hostilities. In such a time frame, the US would simply not have time to procure more ships to actually land a huge force, akin to one on D-Day in 1944. The current US landing ship fleet still doesn't offer nearly as much capacity. If 75% of it was used due to maintenance issues, that would mean some 30,000 troops would land, with equipment. The problem is, essential ports would be quite far away. There's no Britain right across the channel as in D-Day. The US would transform the Ryukyu Islands in the south into logistic hubs and ports. The islands closest to Kyushu are tiny, and that means the distances to be crossed by ships would sometimes have to be quite big. Subsequent waves to Kyushu would take days, and as with any landing, fewer and fewer of those ships would carry troops, while more and more would need to carry supplies. The US Navy does have several large ships to serve as offshore logistics bases, but compared to the islands, they would be a drop in the bucket, and they couldn't really be risked to operate just 100 miles away from Japan. Air assaults would augment the amphibious ones, but even using half the US cargo plane fleet at once would result in maybe 20,000 very lightly equipped troops. Airdropping anything is extremely inefficient, and an actual heavy-duty army brigade would require a few hundred planes to be brought in. The Japanese, on the other hand, would be able to concentrate most of their ground forces near the US landing zone. Given the very good road network in Japan, the limited number of airstrikes in a given period of time, and the sheer amount of targets, as Japan is a huge nation, Japan would likely be able to react within 24 hours and overwhelm the invaders with superior numbers and heavy weapons. Today, Japan's ground forces number 150,000 active troops, but after months of mobilization, Those would be augmented not only by the reserves, but also by the mobilized populace of Japan. Just what sort of numbers we are talking about here is hard to say. If 1% of Japan's male population aged 18 to 50 answered the mobilization call, it could add another 230,000 troops, though the said figure is likely a gross underestimate. Various polls asking how many Japanese would fight for their country usually suggest a little over 10% of the population would be willing to fight, so a million or two more mobilized soldiers is a more realistic figure. Then again, the majority of those might not have access to proper equipment, even if they do have enough time to get trained. Nevertheless, the initial US attack location would hardly be a surprise for the Japanese, and a few 100,000 well-equipped troops would converge on the US landing zones. While the US troops would largely be just infantrymen in light vehicles, the Japanese would meet them with tanks, heavier infantry fighting vehicles, and artillery. The Marines would hardly have time to deploy a lot of artillery on the beaches. They've retired their tanks 2 years ago, but for a war like this, they would likely bring them back online. The battles on the south of Kyushu would rage for days, as the US tries to deliver more and more troops, but gets stuck in the logistics hell of actually supplying the troops on the beachheads. The Japanese army would focus more and more of their army to that one spot, now being sure the landing area wasn't a decoy. It wouldn't be unrealistic to expect that the initial 50,000 US troops would be met with a few times more Japanese troops on the first day. But then it might take the US a few more days to double their number, while the Japanese might grow their troops on the battlefield by a factor of 10. Most likely, if the US attempts to go right for Japan's mainland so soon, it would fail. So what it would really do is this: take its time, not just 1 year but 2 or 3 years if needed. Build up a huge fleet of landing ships. At the same time, take away every single of the Japanese islands around the mainland islands. Taking those would still be costly in lives, but less so than attempting a premature mass invasion. And taking Tsushima in particular might result in Japan having very few trade ships coming in. After 3 years of partial blockade, the Japanese economy would be in ruins. Japan imports almost all of its oil. Indeed, its production is just 500 million liters per year, which is hardly enough for the armed forces, let alone for keeping industry running. With the US surrounding Japan more and more, those oil imports would keep dropping. And it's not just oil. Japan currently produces only 37% of its food needs, though that's a tricky metric as Japan chose to import more and produce less over the decades, so more food like rice would be produced over the partial blockade period. People would on average be hungry and would lack certain food groups, but mass starvation would not likely happen. 3 years after the start of the war, Japan would not be in a much better position than they were just after the first year. Not many more troops could be mobilized. The population would be tired and demoralized. Industry would be suffering immensely after 3 years of bombardment. And pretty much all the big military items like ships and even planes would eventually be tracked and destroyed by the US in such a time frame, including any possible new builds. So when the US would try to do an invasion, this time with several times larger initial force, it would manage to secure a foothold. It would still be a long and bloody road after that, first conquering the entire Kyushu island, then likely using it as a staging ground for another huge invasion, taking Tokyo. By then, Japan would most likely surrender. It would be a bloody war with both sides suffering over 1 million dead and wounded, but the final outcome would be only a matter of time. The US economy and war machine is simply such that given enough years and providing the morale is maintained, it could conquer almost any country in the world. Now a few more details on Conflict of Nations. It's free to play, it's PvP and it's grand strategy, and I mean grand. Running an entire country takes effort. You're gonna have to forge official alliances with other players at times to take over the world. Games diplomacy gives you many options. Economy must also be taken care of. There's variables such as population density and morale in-game as well. Look at these beautifully rendered modern weapons, nuke subs, stealth fighters, airborne infantry, and so on. Research tree features more than 250 different items. Conflict of Nations is methodical, moves are carefully planned and attack orders can take hours to fulfill. So give it a try. You'll get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link below the video. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.